They say funerals reveal more about the living than the dead, and that day, as we stood under the heavy gray sky that threatened rain, I realized how brutally true that saying was. The air smelled of damp earth and roses, the kind of mix that makes your throat tighten with memories you don't want to face. And there we were, gathered around the wooden box that carried the body of the woman who had shaped our lives in ways none of us could fully admit. Grandma was gone, and while some stood in silence, faces heavy with grief, others shifted restlessly, whispering, as if even her death had become a stage for judgment. My younger sister, barely 20 and far too eager to look detached, leaned toward me with that sly grin she often wore when she wanted to stir trouble. Her voice, sharp enough for the people in the row ahead to hear, cut through the stillness, like glass snapping underfoot. "She's just playing soldier." She rolled her eyes toward the folded flag resting on the coffin, dismissing the honor guard lined up with immaculate precision, their uniforms pressed, their faces carved from stone. My jaw tightened, not just from the insult but from the ignorance. Behind it, Grandma wasn't playing. She had lived it, and every wrinkle in her weathered skin carried the proof. I wanted to snap back at my sister, to silence her mockery with the weight of truth, but before I could, a rustle went through the crowd. It wasn't the kind of rustle that comes from shuffling feet or whispered condolences. It was something heavier, more deliberate. A tall man in a dark dress uniform stepped forward, his chest glinting with rows of ribbons that spoke louder than words. The sharp silver stars on his shoulders caught the dim light like fire, and suddenly, the whispers died. A 3-star general had risen from the crowd, and in that instant, every scoff, every smirk, every unspoken doubt about who my grandmother truly was, evaporated into stunned silence. The general's movement felt like a ripple through the entire funeral gathering, a current that pulled everyone's attention toward him whether they wanted it or not. He didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't even hesitate as he stepped out of his seat, the medals on his chest catching the dim light like fragments of history. Each small decoration gleamed as though it carried a memory of a battlefield, a story of sacrifice, a victory earned through blood and discipline. And somehow those stories felt like they belonged not just to him, but to the woman lying inside that coffin. My sister, who had moments earlier laughed at the idea of Grandma being a soldier, froze with her lips parted, the words she might have said next, dying before they reached her tongue. The hush around us was so thick it was almost alive, broken only by the distant caw of a crow circling above the cemetery and the soft rustle of flags swaying in the summer wind. The general paused near the casket, his jaw tight, his posture straight as though even in mourning he carried the weight of command. And then he looked out over the rows of family, friends, and strangers gathered, his gaze sharp enough to pierce right through the polite masks people wear at funerals. His voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud, but it was steady, deliberate, the kind of tone that carried authority, whether spoken on a battlefield or over a grave. "She was no pretender," he began, each syllable heavy, deliberate, layered with respect and conviction. "Do not let anyone reduce her life to something she was not." My sister shifted beside me, color draining from her cheeks, as though the general had looked straight at her and responded to her mocking words. In truth, maybe he had. He went on, telling us things that most of us never knew, weaving together pieces of Grandma's life like a tapestry that had been hidden behind closed doors, now finally unfurled before us. He spoke of missions carried out in silence, of borders crossed not for glory but for duty, of comrades lost and orders followed with the kind of discipline only the truly devoted understood. With every detail he revealed, the image of the fragile, old woman we thought we knew melted away, and in her place stood a figure larger than life, someone who had fought, bled, and sacrificed, not for recognition but for the freedom we all took for granted. My throat burned as I realized how little I had understood her, how many times I had brushed off her quiet stares and half-told stories as the ramblings of age. And yet, here was a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with her, in moments none of us could imagine, standing now to make sure we never forgot. As the general's words spread through the crowd, I felt time itself stretching, as though the air had thickened and we were caught in something larger than a funeral. It was history, being dragged into the present, whether we were prepared for it or not. People who had shuffled in with little more than courtesy now sat straighter, their hands folded tighter, their eyes fixed on the man who spoke of my grandmother, not as an old woman whose last years had been marked by fading memory and trembling hands, but as a warrior who had carried burdens that most of us could not endure for even a day. He spoke of her resilience, of her grit, of the battles that were never written about in newspapers, but whose outcomes shaped the safety of thousands. His voice painted images in my mind, a younger version of her, boots sinking into foreign soil, radio crackling under her hand as she relayed orders in the middle of chaos. Her face streaked with mud, yet her eyes sharp with determination. The general's tone shifted as he recalled how she had once saved an entire unit, not by charging forward with a weapon, but by intercepting enemy communication, cracking codes under pressure that others had declared unbreakable. He described her sitting in a dimly lit bunker, the world shaking with artillery fire overhead, her fingers racing across keys, her brain working faster than the bullets outside, and because of her, dozens of men walked away from a battle they otherwise would not have survived. My sister's earlier smirk was now replaced with something raw and unsettled shame. Perhaps, or all but, she remained silent, staring down at her shoes as though unwilling to meet the eyes of anyone who had heard her cruel remark. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her we didn't know, none of us really knew, but my own chest was tight with a mix of guilt and wonder. How many times had I sat across from Grandma at her kitchen table, her frail hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes distant, as though watching something play across the walls that I could not see. I had mistaken it for the fog of age, never realizing it was memory-heavy, unshakable memory that weighed on her. The general paused, his breath steady but his eyes glassy, betraying the emotions he otherwise concealed. He leaned down then, placing a hand gently on the coffin, the gesture not of a superior to a subordinate, but of a brother to a sister in arms. She wore no armor at the end, he said softly, but make no mistake, your grandmother never stopped being a soldier. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it wasn't forced, it was reverence. Even the wind seemed to still, the world holding its breath in acknowledgement of the truth we had all overlooked until now. The stillness after the general's words lingered like a heavy mist, and I could feel it pressing against my chest, making my breaths shallow. Around me, faces I had grown up with, uncles, cousins, neighbors, who had seen Grandma only as the quiet, bent woman tending roses in her backyard, were transfixed, their expressions changing as though they were seeing her. For the first time, there was something both humbling and unsettling about realizing that the person you thought you knew best carried a secret life far greater than anything you could imagine. My mind spiraled back to small moments, insignificant at the time, now crackling with new meaning. The way Grandma stood at attention during national anthems, her spine straighter than people half her age, how she never spoke ill of anyone in uniform, even when others complained about politics or wars, how she kept a locked chest in the attic that no one was allowed to touch. The one we children joked was filled with old love letters or photographs she was too shy to share. But now I wondered if inside it lay medals, documents, coded journals, artifacts of a life lived in shadows. Far away from the comfort of rocking chairs and knitting needles, the general continued, his words growing heavier, and with every syllable the myth we had unknowingly built around. Grandma Vera's only a fragile matriarch who baked pies and gave soft hugs, crumbled, revealing a steel foundation that we had all been too blind to recognize. There were missions, he said, his gaze sweeping across us as though daring us to look away. That never made it into records, that will never be declassified in your lifetimes, and your grandmother was at the center of them. She carried burdens that none of us could ever repay. His hand trembled slightly then, and for the first time I saw the cost of remembrance in his eyes, tears unshed, memories locked behind years of discipline, now cracking through. He described the night operation in freezing mountains, when communication lines had failed and their unit was stranded. Supplies dwindled, morale broken, frostbite setting in. They had resigned themselves to death until she, the woman now lying silent in a coffin, had taken a battered radio, rebuilt it from scraps, and sent a coded message so precise and so swift that rescue arrived within hours. She didn't boast about it, he said, his voice cracking just enough for the truth to cut deeper. She didn't ask for medals or thanks. She just moved on to the next task. That was who she was. I swallowed hard, because I could picture her doing it. Sitting there with steady hands, even as the world froze around her, refusing to let despair take root. My sister sniffed beside me, and when I glanced at her, her eyes glistened though she tried to hide it. This was the same girl who had sneered only minutes ago, who had dismissed Grandma's military honors as theatrics. and now her shoulders shook, her lips pressed tight as though holding back an apology no one had demanded but everyone could hear echoing in her silence. The rows of uniformed men and women behind the general shifted slightly, their boots crunching in unison on the gravel, and I realized they hadn't just come to perform a ritual, they had come to honor one of their own. They stood not because tradition required it, but because their respect compelled it, because to them she wasn't just somebody's grandmother, she was a comrade, a leader, a protector who had left her mark so deeply on their lives that decades later they still carried her memory like a shield. The sight made my throat ache in a way grief alone could not. It was pride, sorrow, and all woven together, too thick to separate. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it wash over me, and when I opened them, I saw the general step back, his part spoken, leaving the weight of his revelation to settle into each of us like stones, sinking into deep water. As the general stepped back, a silence stretched so long, it felt as though the entire cemetery had forgotten how to breathe. Even the trees seemed to still their rustling, the breeze halting as though nature itself had paused to honor the gravity of what had just been said. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold but from the sheer weight of realization, as though someone had dropped an invisible burden onto my shoulders, one that I should have been carrying all along. I turned my gaze toward the coffin, draped with that neatly folded flag, and suddenly it wasn't just cloth stitched with stars and stripes. It was a symbol of sacrifices that had been made in shadows, of courage hidden beneath years of domestic normalcy, of stories deliberately left untold so that we, her family, could live our lives untouched by the scars of war. A flood of images came unbidden. Grandma teaching me how to tie my shoes, her hands firm but patient. Grandma humming lullabies while the world outside was oblivious to the wars she had fought. Grandma scolding us gently when we wasted food, her eyes narrowing in a way that suggested she knew hunger in a way we never would. How had we not seen it? How had we mistaken her silence for simplicity, her softness for weakness? My sister shifted beside me, her breathing uneven, and when I glanced at her, I saw her wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand, quick and furtive, as though ashamed of her tears. The irony of it hit me with sharp clarity. Moments ago, she had dismissed Grandma as playing soldier, mocking the flag and the honor guard as if they were just props in a drama. And now she was unraveling under the truth that Grandma had been more of a soldier than any of us could ever hope to be. Her lips quivered, and though she didn't speak, I could feel the apology radiating from her, silent but desperate, the kind that can never fully erase words once spoken but still tries to bridge the wound they caused. Around us, others began to stir. An old man in a wheelchair saluted with a trembling hand, his eyes glassy with memory. A woman, clutching her child, pressed a kiss to the boy's hair, as though suddenly aware of the invisible safety net people like Grandma had woven for generations yet unborn. I felt tears sting my own eyes, but I didn't blink them back. For the first time, I wanted to cry, not just because I had lost her, but because I had never truly known her, not in the way that mattered. It struck me that she had chosen this, to carry her burdens in silence, to never seek acknowledgement, to let her children and grandchildren see only the gentle matriarch, not the warrior beneath. Perhaps she had wanted to shield us not only from the dangers she had faced, but from the weight of remembering them. Perhaps she believed her legacy wasn't meant to be told in stories of battles and codes, but in the quieter victories of family dinners, bedtime stories, and unconditional love. The thought both comforted and crushed me, because it meant her silence was a gift, one I had failed to recognize until it was too late. The bugler at the far edge of the service raised his instrument then, and the first haunting notes of taps drifted across the graves. The sound pierced the air like a blade wrapped in velvet, both gentle and devastating, each note carrying the weight of finality. People bowed their heads, hands pressed to hearts, and as the melody echoed through the stillness, I realized something profound. Grandma had been more than a soldier, more than a grandmother, more than a memory. She had been a protector of lives, of futures, of the freedom that allowed us to gather here today, free to mourn her without fear. The last note of taps hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave, and when it finally faded, a deep, aching silence filled the space it left behind. I felt my heart pounding in rhythm with that silence, as though it wanted to fill it with something: words, apologies, gratitude, but no words seemed worthy. My sister finally lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen, the sharpness in her expression dissolved into something fragile and childlike. For the first time in years, she looked younger than me, stripped of the bravado she usually carried like armor. She leaned toward me, her voice no louder than a breath, yet heavy with the weight of remorse. "I didn't know," she whispered, as though the words could travel down into the coffin and reach the ears of the woman we had lost. I wanted to tell her that none of us knew, that Grandma herself had chosen to keep it hidden, but instead, I simply placed my arm around her shoulders, grounding her in the moment we both struggled to hold. Around us, others shifted uncomfortably in their grief, as though realizing they too had underestimated her, reduced her to the boundaries of old age and frailty when she had been so much more. The general remained standing near the casket, his gaze distant now, as if the act of speaking had opened doors in his mind he had long tried to keep shut. I wondered what it cost him to come here, to stand before a family who thought they knew everything about the woman in the coffin, and reveal truths that might never be fully understood. Perhaps he, too, carried regrets, moments he wished he could relive, chances lost, conversations never had. Perhaps this was his way of honoring her, of ensuring that, at least in death, her story wouldn't remain buried in silence. The soldiers behind him shifted in formation, and then two of them stepped forward with mechanical precision, their faces unreadable, their movements rehearsed but no less heartfelt. They lifted the folded flag, pressing it tight, their hands deliberate, their posture exact, as though this small act carried the weight of nations. When they finished, the flag was presented to my mother, Grandma's daughter, whose trembling hands reached out but faltered, as though even touching it would break her. Tears streamed down her face, and as she clutched the fabric to her chest, a sound escaped her lips, half sob, half prayer, something raw enough to fracture the hearts of everyone present. In that moment, the truth finally settled over us like a shroud. Grandma had never played soldier. She had been one. Every laugh, every quiet moment in the garden, every hug at Christmas had been given by someone who had stared death in the face, who had sacrificed so we could live untouched by the horrors she carried. The enormity of it made my legs weak, and I found myself gripping the edge of my chair for balance. My sister covered her face with her hands, the sound of her muffled crying breaking the silence, but no one judged her now. Instead, there was understanding, because each of us was breaking in our own way, piecing together fragments of a woman we had never truly seen whole until today. The funeral began to close with the usual rituals, people rising slowly from their chairs, murmured condolences, the shuffle of feet on gravel, but nothing about the atmosphere felt ordinary anymore. It was as though the general's words had shifted the very ground beneath us, altering the way we would carry Grandma's memory for the rest of our lives. I looked at my sister, her cheeks blotched from crying, her shoulders hunched as though trying to make herself smaller, and for the first time I didn't feel anger toward her. She had been ignorant, yes, cruel even, but hadn't we all been? Hadn't we each, in our own way, reduced Grandma to the limits of what we saw, never daring to imagine that behind her soft voice and wrinkled smile there might be chapters of courage and sacrifice written in shadows? The general moved quietly through the crowd, shaking hands, offering nods of respect, and when he finally approached us, my breath caught. He looked directly at my sister, whose eyes widened under the weight of his gaze. For a moment she looked as though she might collapse, but instead he offered her something unexpected, not rebuke, not judgment, but a faint smile touched with sorrow. She never wanted glory, he told her gently. If she heard your words today, she wouldn't be angry. She'd only hope you'd understand now. My sister's lips parted, but no words, came only tears that slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. Small and desperate, clinging to that mercy like a lifeline. The general placed a hand on my shoulder then, his grip firm, grounding, and with a solemn nod he stepped away, vanishing into the sea of uniforms that dispersed with silent discipline. I stood there for a long moment, watching the coffin sink slowly into the earth, the thud of dirt on wood echoing with a finality that clenched my chest. And yet, for the first time since her passing, I felt not just grief, but pride. Grandma wasn't just ours, she belonged to something greater, a legacy that stretched far beyond family dinners and bedtime stories. She had carried a banner of sacrifice quietly, letting the world underestimate her, so that her loved ones could live without the burdens she bore. I glanced at my sister again, who now clutched Mom's hand tightly, her eyes red but steadier, as though she too had been changed by the truth. The mocking words she had thrown out at the beginning, "She's just playing soldier," were now burned away by revelation, leaving only the knowledge that Grandma had never played at anything. She had lived as a soldier, died as one, and now rested with the honor of one. And as we walked away from the grave, the weight of silence pressing down on us, I knew her story would never again be overlooked, never again be dismissed, because the truth had stood up for her, in the form of a 3-star general, and we had all borne witness